Hello, this is a blog recording, or vlog I should say, to help me largely clarify my ideas for an event that's coming up tomorrow. We've got a conference, religious studies conference at the university where I lecture, and well, not only have I organised it, but I am giving a contribution as well as we go along. The theme of the event is freedom of conscience and speech, and looking at how sometimes those two factors can come into tension with one another, in that we may believe people are free to believe whatever it is that they want, but not necessarily free to say whatever it is that they want. And of course there are occasions when saying something can offend somebody else by appearing to attack their valid and treasured beliefs, as comedians and so on often find out when they make a joke about something that somebody else is offended by or upset by and what have you. So it's looking at all of those sorts of issues. The particular angle that I'm coming at it from, and I'm still formulating ideas around this, which, as I say, is one of the reasons why I'm recording this, to help me try and get those thoughts into something approaching a logical order, is that there is a difference between believing something quietly and acting upon it. I could believe all manner of things. If I never tell anyone what I believe, it's almost impossible for them to know what I believe. If I believe there's a dragon living in my attic, until the moment I tell somebody that, they're going to be totally unaware that I'm thinking this. Once I tell them, my belief is starting to translate into a form of action. Very minimal form of action, just telling somebody that I think there's a dragon in the attic. Is perhaps the lowest level of action I can take with that belief in terms of my social interaction with other people. If I want to go and leave bourbon biscuits for the dragon to eat in the attic and no one knows I'm doing it, it is an action, but it's not one with any social impact in that other people don't know I'm doing it. But once I start to tell other people, then perhaps you could argue that at some level it is maybe preaching in a way, in that if I inform people of my belief, I may not do it in a very convincing manner, in a very zealous manner. I mean, simply say it as a statement. But even by saying it as a statement, I'm inviting the person I've said it to think about what I've said. And they will inevitably reflect on whether or not they share my belief. They might think I'm ludicrous. They may think I'm just a little bit strange. They may think I'm dangerous. Or they may think I'm completely right, and that there really is a dragon in my attic. I assure you there isn't, it's far too small. Anyway, wittering about dragons in attics is one thing. The issue I'm going to be looking at tomorrow is centred on beliefs around health. Now, just about every religion on the planet has had something to say on the matter of health and healing and disease and so forth. Some of them in very sophisticated, very complex ways. So, for example, the impact of Taoism on Chinese traditional medicine is huge. The impact of Hindu beliefs on Ayurvedic medicine has led to a significant body of medicinal understandings, which have lasted thousands of years. At the other end, we have a lot of New Age beliefs around therapies and treatments and so on, what works, what doesn't work. Holding those beliefs in a quiet way, what I think in terms of myself, is one thing. How I start to articulate those beliefs to other people is another. Because again, as I just suggested, it implies some degree of convincing other people. Maybe in a very minimal way, just stating, I believe this, full stop, let's move on. But maybe in a slightly more passionate way, where I actually am trying to say, look, I believe this, and I think you should try doing this as well. Perhaps because they've said they've had some illness, and I think some medical practice I've tried might help them. Or I myself, possibly, I could be a practitioner of something, and I'm trying to convince this other person that maybe they should be my patient or client, or whatever word you want to use, in applying this treatment I believe in to them. Whether that's some ancient Ayurvedic medicine or whether that's some New Age healing technique that was only dreamt up last Thursday, or whether that's something that exists at a sort of grey area of faith and healing. For example, one of the issues I'll be looking at tomorrow is snake handling in Appalachian churches, which isn't full-on healing, but it is a demonstration of faith by overcoming poisons. Not only do people handle poisonous snakes, which occasionally bite them, but sometimes they also drink snake venom and strychnine and things like that to demonstrate that their faith is so intense they won't succumb to the health risks of drinking something which is dangerous. So it's not full-on healing, but it is in this sort of grey area where it is testing the body through faith to demonstrate the intensity of faith. If I want to lock myself in a room and handle poisonous snakes and nobody else knows I'm doing it, that's one thing. If I start to do that in front of other people, whether it's in a church or in the middle of the street, or I've hired a village hall to do it in, or whatever other circumstances, by demonstrating it to other people, it becomes a form of preaching. It becomes a form of putting my ideas out there for other people to watch. And again, some people might think I am unhinged for doing such a thing, or very misguided, or be inspired by it and want to have a go at doing it themselves, perhaps. So that where it becomes an issue with both ethical and potentially legal ramifications and a philosophical angle in terms of understanding what is going on in faith and religion and so forth, is at that point where it's passing out of a purely internalized idea for myself and it's becoming something that I'm presenting to other people, and it's having an impact on the life of other people. Possibly a very good impact in some cases. For example, I qualified as a masseur many years ago. I'm quite convinced of the evidence I've seen, both in terms of my own practice and looking at research evidence and so on, that massage does have health benefits, relaxing the muscles, helping the endocrine system, all sorts of other things. So it's something I both do myself, but also even when it comes to other forms of healing and therapy, things I don't necessarily believe in myself. I don't want to list the ones I'm very cynical of, because otherwise it sort of strays off the point a little. But I do think there's a lot of spiritual health practices which are frankly quite dangerous, or in some cases simply ineffective. That's my personal conviction. Whether it's one I believe in or one somebody else believes in, there is a degree in which it is presented to the public and other people are invited to participate. And this is where we get into an interesting issue, which is not so much the freedom of belief or speech when it comes to selling the joys of this particular healing technique to other people, but what we might term the accountability of speech or the accountability of belief. That there has to come a point where it's one thing to run around saying, I think this, I think that, I think the other, to an empty room with no one listening. It's another when you're telling other people what you think, and implicitly or explicitly gently leading them to try and follow you, because they will then become involved. And if what you are convinced of is ineffective, and they maybe are foregoing better treatments in favour of an ineffective one, if they've got some illness or injury or what have you, or is actively dangerous, such as the drinking of snake venom, is a fairly obvious example, then I can be leading other people to engage in something that could be very, very damaging, possibly even terminal, to their health. And that is where accountability comes into play. It's one thing for me to believe it quietly, it's another thing for me to present it to other people and to lead them into that belief. Is this something that the law should be involved in, the government should be involved in terms of the regulation of preaching about matters of health and faith, whereby if it can be evidenced that something I have told somebody else has actually damaged their health, or ended their life, or had a discouraging impact in the sense that they've tried something ineffective instead of trying something else that would have been effective, and therefore their illness has got worse or simply persisted much longer than it otherwise would have needed to. Should I be held accountable? I'm not wholly sure, I have to admit, at this stage in my thoughts, whether that is even practical as a legal approach, a legalised approach. Ethically, morally, I think, yes, I should be held accountable, but there is a difference between a moral stance and a legal one, being able to translate something into an actual law code. And I'm not wholly sure about the practicalities of whether that would work in terms of how I could be held accountable. Should I be sent to prison? Should I have a gag order placed on me? In this day and age of websites and blog pages and things here, there and everywhere, how do you realistically stop someone promoting a particular point of view if that point of view is a dangerous point of view? Obviously, the government's main focus at the moment on those sorts of things is in terms of political ranting and raving and preaching, rather than more sort of mystical, therapeutic ideas and understandings that might be promoted. But my focus for tomorrow is on the religious side rather than the political side. It's an interesting idea, and it brings in various philosophical concepts. I won't get too bogged down in these for the sake of this podcast, but to think about them. Back in 1877, a chap called William Kingdon Clifford argued that we do have an ethics of belief, that people shouldn't believe stuff if there is no evidence for it, that they should, when they're considering an idea, do I believe this, do I not, they should look at the epistemology, that is to say, what is the evidence that this belief is a true one, an accurate one. They should weigh the evidence up, and if, on the balance of probabilities, the evidence is convincing, they believe it. If the evidence is unconvincing, or there's better contradictory evidence to some different way of thought, they should not believe this, they should believe the contrary way of thought instead. William James did suggest that Clifford was ladling it on a little bit with a trowel, because Clifford argued we should do that with all our beliefs, and James was of the approach that that is getting unrealistic. I believe this is a cup of tea. I believe that largely because I made it. But it looks like tea, smells like tea, tastes like tea. Am I going to send it off for chemical analysis before I'm convinced it is tea? Well, I think that is taking it too far. The vast majority of things I believe and think, like the colour of the wallpaper and who the Prime Minister is and this sort of thing, I believe it with very minimal evidence. And we get through life believing most of the things about the world around us on very, very minimal evidence. We don't test and test and test and test. We don't sit there having long, prolonged philosophical discussions about epistemology. Otherwise, we'd never even get out of bed in the morning if we took it that far. However, James was of the opinion that the important things in life we should certainly evaluate. Whether or not that's tea in the cup is trivial, is besides the point. Bigger issues we should certainly evaluate and think about, and it would be better to believe in things because of evidence than because of faith. The alternative approach, fideism, suggests we can take things, some things at least, on faith. There's moderate fideism, in which we believe things on the balance of probability. It's probably true, or we hope it's true, in that sort of vein. I might hope it is the case that some now extinct animal, the Tasmanian tiger, still exists somewhere in the wild, even though it's not been seen in many a long year. I've got no material evidence to suggest that the Tasmanian devil still exists, but I might believe it does, or hope it does, or trust that it does, on very little more than you might say wishful thinking or hopefulness. Harder fideism is believing something despite evidence to the contrary. So you might believe that your husband or wife is faithful to you despite half a dozen friends telling you that they have seen him or her out cheating with 12 different people. But you go on hoping and believing that they are loyal and faithful and so on. The cynical might say that an awful lot of religion boils down to that kind of fideism of hoping that gods and spirits and ancestors and various things exist despite contradictory evidence. Other people would say they've had experiences which wouldn't stand up to the evidence of hard science, the testing or requirements of hard scientific evidence, but are enough to convince them that this or that deity, ancestor, spirit, being, what have you, exists. That comes back into play with things like these issues around health and the spiritual convictions that this form of healing works, or people become ill because of this, that and the other rather abstract philosophical reasons. Sometimes it's based upon several thousand years worth of people trying out medical techniques, them appearing to work with or without modern Western scientific measures and standards, but perhaps years and years of, well, my granny got better when she did this. That sort of slightly anecdotal but perhaps nonetheless convincing evidence. Should people make health claims which lack that sort of evidence, of expecting other people to take something with a very large leap of faith? I'm going to look at someone tomorrow who is quite well known on the internet for making rather wild claims about the nature of health and healing. I'm not going to say who, because I don't think this person deserves any more publicity on the net than they've already got. But they do make some very odd claims and make an awful lot of money out of people who believe in their very odd claims. There are quite a lot of other faith healers in the world who maybe don't make anywhere near as much money. Some of them don't make any money at all. But people come to them believing that the laying on of hands or meditating or chanting or doing this, that and the next thing is going to restore their health. Maybe sometimes it does. Maybe quite a lot of the time it doesn't. Where it doesn't, should the person claiming it does be held accountable for that claim, for effectively misleading other people. If I convince somebody else about that dragon in my attic, and this other person, Gladys, believes there is a dragon in my attic, and she joins me in leaving bourbon biscuits up there for it to eat, it has no obvious harmful impact upon her life. Maybe she loses a few pence here and there buying those bourbon biscuits. Maybe she could have spent the time going up to the attic to leave the biscuits there, doing something slightly more useful. But in the grand scheme of things, it's very petty, it's very minor, it's not a major issue. Therefore, holding me accountable for convincing Gladys there's a dragon in the attic that likes bourbon biscuits seems relatively pointless. There are better things to do with one's time than hold somebody accountable for something that trivial. However, if I had convinced Gladys that waving an amethyst crystal in the air would cure her tumours, and instead of going to a doctor, she just sits there waving an amethyst crystal in the air and dies of tumours that could have been treated had she gone to a doctor, then I would argue there is a definite need for accountability there. Because no matter how much faith I have in the truth of what I've claimed, if there is a lack of evidence there, and this is something that Clifford would certainly have said, if there's a lack of evidence there for me to have believed it, then equally there's a lack of evidence for her to believe it. You could say the same there. So she has a responsibility for her naive belief in my claims, as much responsibility as I have, but she's the one who's died, not me. Should there be some form of moral accountability? Possibly, if people can work out the practicalities of it. Legal accountability. That's where I think there has to be some degree of argument that's needed. Should that accountability result in censorship is another issue, which I'll be looking at tomorrow. In other words, should I be gagged and prevented from going around telling people about waving purple crystals in the air? An argument certainly could be made that a lot of these sorts of claims are very dangerous claims. They're very risky claims to make. But we're also in the situation where what I consider dangerous and risky, somebody else might not, and vice versa. It has been argued. Richard Dawkins is a prominent person to argue it, but I actually had briefly supervised someone once who was doing a research project suggesting that telling your kids that Father Christmas exists is psychologically damaging to them, which is one of the daftest research projects I've ever come across. And yet it's something that Richard Dawkins, in all of his status and social standing and so forth, has claimed in all seriousness as well. Should people be gagged from talking about Santa Claus because Richard Dawkins thinks it's damaging? Personally, I think Richard Dawkins needs to get a life when it comes to that sort of an issue. If he thinks that's a problem, that kind of shows you just how ragingly middle class somebody has to be to think that's a serious issue when there is so many genuine problems in the world that could be tackled instead. But there he is, making a claim of harm and risk. I'm making a claim of harm and risk about these hypothetical purple crystals being waved in the air. It can be difficult to assess what is a dangerous belief, what is just a silly belief, or a naive belief, or a romantic belief, or however you want to phrase it. What is dangerous to me is not dangerous to somebody else. My personal religious beliefs are, I think, quite harmless. Bad, quite potty, frankly, but harmless. If we were talking to a devout TV evangelist from the deep south of America, they would probably say my beliefs are dangerous because they are plunging me straight to hell because I'm not believing what they think I should be believing. And if I've convinced other people to believe in my slightly eccentric notions about dancing around trees at the full moon, then I have led those people away from the truth of Christ and plunging straight into hell and so on. So they might argue that I should be gagged and censored, and certainly if we're thinking historically, that has happened in Britain, that's happened in many parts of the world where a religious organisation has had huge influence over government and introduced laws that censor differing religious beliefs, which from a modern 21st century terribly liberal perspective might not seem particularly harmful in any way, shape, form or guise. But to those who think there is absolutely one truth, any slight deviation from that is plunging headlong into hell, then even the slightest deviation, even something that looks harmless and a little bit potty and a little bit whatever, is nonetheless dangerous. And this is the concern, is that whilst I might start saying, well, that belief there, the purple crystal, is leading some people to become seriously ill or doing things that might even kill them, other people could also make claims about supposed dangers for other beliefs, which I personally find harmless or a little silly or a little naive or quite twee and sweet and romantic or whatever, but they think are dangerous. And this is why I'm very wary and cautious of any kind of legally imposed censorship that would silence someone entirely. But not silencing them doesn't mean they have to get away scot-free with saying anything they damn well please. If what they have said has caused harm, they could be held responsible for it. They could be held accountable for it. Whether that's in terms of paying a fine, whether that's in terms of paying compensation to people injured or harmed by the silly things that they've said, or, well, maybe in extreme situations putting people in prison or whatever, although that's not a route I think personally we should go down, but whatever kind of accountability was legally viable could still be imposed without needing to silence that person. So it then becomes their choice if they want to keep going around saying the same daft thing again and again, knowing that they're going to get fine after fine after fine, or whatever it might be, community service and so forth. Then at some point you would kind of hope that common sense would tell them to keep their yap shut. But it would still be their choice not to keep their yap shut. If their conviction in what they believed led them down that course of action. So then it becomes a matter of personal choice and personal responsibility rather than government-imposed silencing of strange, peculiar, potentially dangerous points of view. And certainly within the world of faith and belief, There's all manner of really quite strange, peculiar, potentially dangerous points of view. I don't think my beliefs are potentially dangerous, but they're certainly strange and peculiar, and I'm sure that's true of many other people as well. So that's loosely the areas I'm thinking of going down tomorrow. Hopefully by the time I'm actually stood up in front of the class and conference rather, and spouting these ideas, they'll be a little bit more coalesced, but it's something to think about for the moment, and I'll be interested to hear feedback, differing points of view as to how you think these sorts of issues should be handled. Thank you.